Hi everyone, welcome to the channel Tech with KG. Today we're going to be talking about my guide for Neo QLED TVs as well as QLED TVs. So if you own any sort of QLED TVs, you could try these settings out for yourself and see if they have any success. Now I just want to say that these settings are all based on my personal preference and you don't have to copy them one for one. If you feel like anything needs to change in that, say for example contrast enhancer, if you want that on, go ahead and turn that on. This is just a guideline of what settings I suggest you to use. Alright, so without further ado, let's start with the SDR category for TV shows and movies. So one of the more important things here would probably be the brightness slider. This is going to definitely be more so your personal preference and your room environment. So depending on how your lighting is, this is how you would like to set the brightness of your TV. The brightness setting is simply just the backlight of the TV itself. So you can control that. So if it's at 50, you are at max brightness for the backlight. If it's at 0, then you are at the minimum brightness for the backlight. So you just want to find a good sweet spot that is going to make you happy. I like to have my brightness at about 30 personally. I think that's a good sweet spot for the SDR viewing. Like I said, it really just depends on the lighting in your room and what time of day you watch TV the most. Going on next to contrast, this is one where I would not leave this at max contrast because you will see things start to clip in terms of the color. So you will see color clipping if you have 50 contrast. I really recommend around 40 to 42. You could get away with 45, but you do start to see some things clip at that point. I personally like 40 on the contrast level. It just ends up giving me a really good picture overall, and I'm very happy with the results when it is at 40 contrast for SDR. The next category is color. I think at 25, this is just fine. I would not move it at all for 25. It is just really good in my opinion. I like 25 color for the SDR settings. If you feel like you need a little bit more saturation, you can bump this up to 30. And if you feel like it's a little oversaturated, you can bump this down to 20. I would not go below 20 and I would not go above 30. The next one is contrast enhancer. And this definitely goes back to personal preference, but I keep this off on SDR. And really, it just depends on what I'm watching. If I'm watching something like a Pixar movie, I will turn on contrast enhancer to high because I actually think that will make some Pixar movies look a lot better. But if I'm watching some more realistic movies and TV shows, I do keep contrast enhancer off because it can destroy some of the depth that is there in terms of the picture quality. Next thing is color tone. This is again personal preference. This is totally up to you. If you like a standard color tone, use a standard color tone. And if you like something more warmer, I suggest warm 2. Warm 2 seems to be closest to that D65 point if that's what you're going for. Warm 2 seems to be the one to go with. Now, it does depend on panel variants and the white balance will vary from panel to panel. So just keep that in mind. Some people have had results where the warm 1 was actually closer, but it seems like the majority of the TVs that come out from Samsung, it is warm 2 that gets you closest to that mark. The next thing I want to talk about is color space. Color space, I like to leave this on auto. This is again one of those personal preference settings. Use what you like here, but I think auto is just fine. The next one is gamma. I like to keep this at 2.2. The next one is shadow detail. You can go ahead and bump this down to -1 or -2 if you want to. If you're not crushing shadows, you can go ahead and do that. And it will give you a little bit more perceived deeper blacks in the picture quality. Now, this is just something that is optional for you to do, but if you ever see black crush, you can go ahead and raise the shadow detail back up. So really the shadow detail slider is what it says. Give it a shot, see what you like on that setting. Most people probably leave it at 0 and it's just fine. The next thing is going to be local dimming. So local dimming for SDR, I think it is going to depend on what you watch with SDR, but for the most part, regular movies, TV shows, more realistic things like that, I like to keep it on local dimming low. This seems to be the best results in terms of picture depth, in terms of picture quality. It just is going to be the best setting for me personally, so that's what I use. Alright, moving on to HDR. I can't ever recommend changing the brightness setting for HDR, so leave it at 50. Moving on to contrast. Contrast is also one of those ones where you probably just want to leave this at 50. Yes, there's a chance that colors are clipping, but if you decrease the contrast here, you will go ahead and decrease the brightness. And for HDR, you probably want the maximum amount of brightness possible. So leaving the contrast at 50 is probably ideal for most people. If you want absolutely no clipping at all, you can lower the contrast, but keep in mind you are going to lose brightness. I realized I didn't cover sharpness on SDR, so I'm going to cover it right here. Personally, I keep my sharpness at 7. This is a good sweet spot between 10 and 0. Going to 10 is something you can get away with, but I did personally notice a little bit of artifacts in shows and movies. They're small and it's not that noticeable, but I did notice it, and lowering the sharpness helped with that. Now, color, I keep color at 25. It's just what I like on the Neo QLEDs. For movies and TV shows, I feel like 25 works. Alright, so contrast enhancer here, HDR contrast enhancer, I hardly ever use it. There's really no reason for me to use it in HDR. I think that leaving it off is going to be your best bet. But again, contrast enhancer is your personal preference. Going on to color tone, I keep this the same on my SDR as well. It's warm too, so that's just my preference. Again, you use the color tone / color temperature you want here. Color space, again, I keep this on auto. The next one is going to be the ST2084 slider. You can go ahead and bump this up if you want a little more of a brightened HDR look, but keep in mind you will be lifting the overall picture. So if you care about that, go ahead and leave it at 0 or -1. That's probably going to be your best bet for the ST2084 slider. Again, for the shadow detail slider, if you feel like the blacks are crushed a little bit, just bump it up a little bit and see if that helps. For HDR local dimming, you can keep this on high or standard. You should play around with this on different movies and TV shows and see which one you like better. I've seen results where standard looks like it gives me better highlights, more impactful highlights than local dimming high, but local dimming high will also give me more detail within shadows and highlights for the whole entire picture. So in terms of blooming, it goes from low. Low is something I don't really recommend on HDR at all. Standard is going to control the blooming quite a bit. And if you put local dimming on high, you will crush some details in order to give you minimal blooming. Alright, moving on, let's talk about SDR gaming really quickly. So the brightness level here, I actually keep this at 50 for gaming. I know you might say, why did you keep it at 30 for TV shows and movies, but 50 for gaming? I personally just like my gaming as bright as possible for the backlight. When I'm gaming on an LCD TV or an OLED TV, I don't really care. I crank up that backlight to the maximum. That's why I feel like games should be played. So that's what I do. Sharpness here, again, I don't like 0 sharpness, not even for games. I just think it makes it a little bit too blurry for me. I want some kind of clarity in the text, and with the sharpness at 7, I get that, and it's not over sharpened for other things. So that's something that I really enjoy. All right, going on to the next one, color. Color, I actually like to keep this at 30 for the SDR, because some of the SDR games that I play, personally, I feel like I wish I had a little bit more color on there. So I'm cool with that extra bit of saturation, that extra bit of color in game mode. Contrast enhancer, this is something that you could actually use for SDR games depending on the game. I do use this on high or low, but there are times where I also keep it off. So this is another personal preference thing. I'm going to go ahead and put it off on this settings guide, but you can use it if you want. I use it sometimes personally, and this is something that, yeah, if you like it, use it. If you don't, don't. All right, color tone, same thing as we talked about before. Warm 2 is cool with me on everything. It's just what I'm used to personally with my eyes, so that's what I roll with. Gamma here, again, 2.2 is what I go with for the gamma. Shadow detail, go ahead and put this at -2 or -1. I think that this is going to give you a better perceived black level for SDR games, and sometimes SDR games really need that, especially when you're playing on an LCD TV. So yeah, I like shadow detail on -2, and I feel like the QN90B and the QN85B have pretty good shadow detail, specifically the QN90B. I think maybe on the QN85B, I would leave this at maybe 0 or -1, but on the QN90B, you could definitely put it down to -2. Local dimming high is what I use for gaming, even though I use it low on the SDR movies and TV shows. I like high on gaming. It just gives me a better overall look. All right, let's move on to HDR gaming. So HDR gaming, brightness at 50, contrast at 50, same thing like I explained earlier. You really don't want to change the HDR contrast because you're going to lose too much brightness. Sharpness, again, I keep it at 7, just a personal preference. Color here I actually have at 35, and I know what you're thinking, that's pretty high. It is pretty high, but in HDR game mode for the QN90B, when I experienced it, it needed that extra boost of color. For some reason, I don't know why, it just felt like it did. And so 35 color really did the job. On the QN85B, I actually had this at 30 color and it was just fine. So 30 color for the QN85B, 35 for the QN90B. Again, play around with this. This is sort of personal preference and you base it off of what you want. Contrast enhancer, I never use this in HDR. I don't think it's worth it in HDR. So yeah, personally, I just keep it off in HDR. But again, personal preference, you do what you want there. Color tone, warm 2. Color space, auto. Same thing like I explained earlier. ST2084, I actually keep this at -2 because the game modes on Samsung TVs tend to be overbrightened to a degree that I'm not really liking too much on certain darker games. So I do like to keep this down at -2. And to go along with the ST2084 to -2 change, I bump up the shadow detail to +2 here. Local dimming I keep at high because the amount of local dimming that you get in game mode is reduced. So local dimming high is going to almost perform like standard in that way. And it feels like standard is at low and then low almost feels like it doesn't really work good at all. So I like to use high so I can crank out as much local dimming performance as possible in game mode. And it's as simple as that. What do you guys think? Tell me in the comments if I missed anything with the settings. Is there something that you would change that I did? Let me know what adjustments you make to your personal settings. I'd love to hear about it. If this video helped you, go ahead and give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more content just like this. And if you want to watch more TV videos, check out the rest of my channel. I have a bunch of content. Thank you guys so much for watching. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.